I'm going to do this squash. And the reason that I'm doing it is because we're dealing with two issues here. You not only have to shade for this entire form, but you also have to add shadows and highlights for each one of these raised areas that are part of the subject itself. And then you have to deal with how are you going to paint these patterns as part of this structure. And the way that I suggest that you do this is to start out by drawing the overall form first and ignoring the pattern or the variegation that is on the surface. Because the first thing that you have to do when you paint this subject is you have to paint it for the form, the three-dimensionality. If you don't do that, your painting is going to look flat. Or the way that this needs to be done is to, first of all, draw the structure of the specimen first, leaving out any pattern that is on the surface. The next thing that you can do a shadow study so that you know where you're going to have to place your shadows. Because in this case, we have a total ellipse. And that means that you're going to have to find the highlight and then shade for the entire form, ignoring the three-dimensionality of each of these ridges. After you've done that, then you go back in and you start to render for the ridges themselves. The next thing that I want you to do, on another piece of tracing paper, I want you to do an overlay that shows just the variegated information that's on this squash. This is going to be the last thing that you do, which is why I want you to put it on a separate piece of tracing paper. And then, once we finish painting this for form, we will add the variegation pattern to the surface. What I've done here is I put in the shadows for the basic form to define the ellipse and not pay any attention to each of these divisions. And if I put a piece of paper underneath here, you can see that this is really the basic shape for this form. So what I've done here is I've also added a little bit of core shadow to right-hand side of this subject. So you can see that basically right now all I'm defining with this shadow is the overall form. The next thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to start looking at all of these divisions here, and I am going to start to put in the shadows and the highlights so that on top of this, you will see the next step, which is to define each individual division in this squash. So let's take a look at this first of all, before we start to create these other shadows. Right now, what we have is we have some shadow. We have shadows for the overall area of this shape. Now look at these. The secondary shadows are the ones that define each of these rounded segments. And if you look at it, because of the way the lighting is hitting it, you will see that this particular shape here, the shadows are along the bottom. Here the shadows are basically in the middle. Why? Because we're getting some reflected light off of the surface of the counter. We are getting, here's our highlight along this edge, which is close to the darkest part of this shape. Down here, this starts to reverse itself. Why? Because this shape curls under. That means we're getting more shadow on this top part of this rounded form. And you can see the reflected light here. And also it's catching a little bit more light because it's raised up. Although you must remember that these, even though these look light, they are not as light as the highlighted area itself, which is why we have created an overall shadow in the first place so that this is compensated for. And here again on this lower raised section, again the shadow is on the top. So here on this shape, the shadow is on the top. On this one, the shadow is on the top of the division. On this one, the shadow is more or less in the middle. On this one, the shadow is on the bottom. On this one, the shadow is on the bottom, but because there's some surface texture in the squash, we're catching a little bit of shadow. But again, here you'll see the shadow is kind of on the bottom. True here also. Now, we're not getting a lot of shadow on this section except up in this area because of the highlight in this section of the squash. It's very important that you really study this because it's counterintuitive, because you would think that because you're always going to have your shadows in the same place, but in fact they aren't, and it's because of this roundness and where the roundness is affected by the light. So here's our basic form. I have just added the shadows in this case for these forms, and you'll see here's my shadow on the bottom. Here's my shadow more or less in the middle. I've got this a little lighter, this a little lighter. On the bottom here, on these last two segments, the shadow is along the top edge of the form. Here it's on the bottom edge of the form. Here it's on the bottom edge of the form. And the same is true here, even though it's very delicate. So when you put these things together, you will have a much more accurate interpretation of the shadows in order to really define this shape. We have our base layer, we have two shadow layers, and then we also have a texture layer. This texture layer is the last thing that gets transferred onto the drawing. Once you have all your shadows in place, then you would transfer this texture, and for the most part, you could just paint this in, and because there's shadow underneath or highlight underneath, whatever is painted where it's dark will be darker, where it's light it'll be lighter, and it should fall into place quite nicely. The first thing we need to do is we need to establish the local colors for this squash. After several studies, I cannot use the pigments that we have in our kit. I've had to go to quinacridone gold mixed with sap green, which is in our kit, in order to get the color for this very pale yellow. And it actually looks quite green when we first start, but once it dries, it seems to change color quite a bit. This is my squash. And this is quinacridone gold plus sap green. So the next color I had to establish was really basically these dark green streaks. And those turn out to be sap green with a little bit of Winsor violet. And this can be concentrated a little bit more if we want it darker. And those are our basic colors. And I'm going to use the Winsor violet for my shadow colors. And dilute it way down. So I'm going to use this as my shadow color. So now we're ready to paint. I had all of these tissues taped to this drawing. The one piece that I'm going to leave on here is the texture placement so that I can transfer that once I have my local color and my shadows established. Because this overall piece is quite yellow, I really want to make sure that the transfer is quite light, because once the yellow goes down, we cannot erase it. Since this piece is so large, and we have to cover a large amount of space with a flat wash, we're going to start with the tea wash. Then we're going to put our shadow down, and then we'll put the secondary shadows down, and then we'll put another tea wash on top of that, just to give a little richness to the color. So, so the first thing we need to do is dampen the area that needs to be painted. so we don't end up with any blotchiness, because this particular specimen is pretty smooth overall. And I can see just by changing the angle of my viewpoint, I can tell where things are very wet, and I can move that moisture around a bit. So we're going to use our puddle technique, and we're going to start putting color down, our first layer of color. Make sure you let gravity give you a hand in this. And if you have a bigger brush than a 4, you can use a bigger brush because you're going to put a lot of color down. Now remember, this will dry lighter than the way it appears right now. Make sure you get your edges. Whatever you have left over, pick it up. Dry your brush, pick it up. Do not leave it there, otherwise you'll get cauliflowering at the edge. Alright, so now we just have to let this dry pretty thoroughly, and we can start to put on our shadow colors. Now my local color has dried, and I'm going to refer to my study for the shadows. I'm working with a very light shade of Windsor Violet, and I'm going to start laying in my color, and these need to be graded tones, so it's going to be important that I clean my brush and feather these edges. And it doesn't look like much right now, but we will build this as we go along. I'm not only going to use the Windsor Violet, but I'm probably going to even use some of the local color. And I've cleaned my brush again, and I'm going to feather out all these very subtle edges that I've created. This is just to get our overall definition for the roundness of this subject. So now we let it dry again. Now I see I've missed an edge here, and I will go back in and touch that up after this dries. I will not do it while I am in the process of waiting for this to dry. And I will build this color up a little bit more so that it matches what I have on my page here. At this point, I've added a second layer of shadow in my core shadow areas to help define the roundness of this form, and you can pretty much see how that's working. So now I'm going to start to add some shadows for each one of the rounded secondary forms that this squash has, and I'm going to pretty much follow what I've done in terms of where these shadows have to fall. And we're going to look at our specimen to see where things go. Now, in some cases, the shadows are very, very light, so I'm going to use my diluted Windsor Violet to apply color to those areas, making sure that I soften things as I go along. I'm going to start down at the bottom edge here because in fact, this bottom edge is going to need to be a little darker along the raised area. Make sure we just soften that edge. And then in this one, we also have a top edge that needs to be done. So we're going to use our pencil guideline for that. And we don't have to worry too much about seeing the pencil because a lot of this will be covered by the green pattern that's on the surface of this squash. Just softening the very edge. Don't go into it too deeply. Now this second area here is really the shadows are really, I have some highlight on the bottom and I have some highlight on the top. So I'm going to work in the middle. And you can see where I already have shadow. The shadow is just going to be enriched. This one, we're going to work on the bottom. And soften that edge. Now you don't have to soften the opposite edge because it's going to be in a fold. So you can see now how this is starting to come together. Okay, we're going to let this dry, and then I'm going to put another layer of local yellow color on top of this.